My name is Christopher, and I am a federal judge by profession. For decades, I have presided over some of the most complex and high-stakes cases in the country. In the courtroom, people know me as firm, unshakable, and uncompromising when it comes to justice. But what I never expected was that one day, the battle for justice would leave the courtroom and come crashing into my personal life. It all started when I moved into a quiet, picturesque neighborhood, thinking it would be the peaceful retreat I deserved after years of serving the law. What I didn't know was that this neighborhood was governed by an HOA, a homeowners association notorious for bullying residents into submission with endless fees, absurd rules, and threats of retaliation for anyone who dared to say no. From the very beginning, I refused to join their membership. I had no interest in paying for their inflated dues or living under the thumb of a group of power-hungry neighbors who thought they ran the community. That's when the tension began. Small things at first, warnings in the mailbox, petty complaints, strange looks at community gatherings. But as the weeks passed, the hostility grew. I could feel the storm brewing long before it arrived, and when it finally did, it came with fire, literally. I came back from a trip to find my house reduced to ashes, burned to the ground, by the very people who thought they could scare me into compliance. But what they didn't realize was that they hadn't just targeted any homeowner. They had just declared war on a federal judge who had put away criminals far more dangerous than them. And unlike those criminals, the HOA had no idea just how unprepared they were for the judgment that was about to come crashing down on them. When I first moved into that neighborhood, the ranch-style home wasn't just a house to me, it was a sanctuary. After years of dealing with endless court sessions, high-profile trials, and nights buried in case files, I wanted a place where silence ruled, where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional hum of cicadas. For the first few months, it felt like I had found it. I kept to myself, took morning walks, and finally breathed air that didn't reek of city smog. But it wasn't long before I noticed the subtle intrusions of the HOA. Flyers demanding membership fees appeared in my mailbox, as if my refusal was simply an oversight rather than a choice. I saw board members patrolling the streets like self-appointed sheriffs, writing down notes about whose lawn was an inch too long or whose shutters didn't meet their standards. To me, these weren't rules, they were chains, and I had spent my entire life breaking chains off people who were powerless to fight back. That's why I ignored them. But what I didn't know was that my silence was making me their prime target. The HOA thrived on control, and my refusal wasn't just a rejection, it was a public defiance that threatened their entire grip on the neighborhood. I thought their harassment was petty. I thought their letters, threats, and glares were nothing more than nuisance. But behind closed doors, they were plotting something far darker, something that would turn my home, my sanctuary, into a smoking graveyard of ashes. And while I couldn't see it yet, every step I took away from their control only fueled the fire that would soon consume everything I had built. The first sign that things were spiraling came in whispers. Neighbors who once waved at me on my morning walks suddenly looked the other way. Invitations to community events never reached my door. It was subtle at first, but I'd seen this pattern too many times in court cases. Ostracization, the kind that breaks people down slowly until they bend. But I wasn't the bending type. Still, the HOA wasn't satisfied with cold shoulders. Soon, I began noticing footprints near my property line that weren't mine. My mailbox was tampered with, official-looking notices stuffed inside threatening. Fines for everything from unapproved fencing to non-compliant landscaping. It was absurd considering I wasn't even a member of their association. And yet, they acted as if their word was law. Then came the letters, anonymous, typed, and dripping with venom. They told me to leave if I couldn't play by their rules. They warned me that the neighborhood doesn't tolerate defiance. It was the kind of cowardly intimidation I'd seen gangs use in the underworld, only now it wore the face of suburban civility. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just some man who'd roll over. I wasn't just Christopher, the quiet neighbor. I was Christopher, federal judge, a man who had spent decades dismantling corruption, exposing lies, and putting predators in cages. Their threats didn't scare me, but they intrigued me. Because threats are like evidence. They always point back to the guilty. At the time, I believed their worst weapon would be fines, gossip, or harassment. I couldn't have been more wrong. They weren't looking to ruin my peace. They were preparing to erase it entirely. The harassment escalated, like a storm gaining strength. One morning, I woke to find red spray paint scrawled across my garage door, "Join or leave." It was the kind of crude message that reeked of desperation, but it told me one important thing: they were no longer hiding in the shadows. I hired a crew to paint over it, but by the next week it happened again. My security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. Their wires cut cleanly, as though by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Even the power to my property flickered on and off at odd hours, plunging me into darkness, as though the neighborhood itself was conspiring against me. Every move they made was a test, pushing me to react, to break down, to flee. But each act only hardened my resolve. I'd seen cartel members, crime syndicates, and corrupt officials use the same playbook in my courtroom. And these people, these petty suburban tyrants, were trying to pull the same tricks in my own backyard. One night, as I sat on my porch with only the sound of cicadas and my own thoughts, I realized something chilling. This wasn't about grass height or membership fees. This was personal. They wanted control, absolute and unquestioned, and anyone who resisted was an enemy to be erased. And when people with unchecked power feel challenged, they don't stop at intimidation. They escalate until they destroy. At that moment, I should have known the fire was coming. The strike came on a night so still it felt unnatural, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I had been working late in my study, sifting through old case files, when the faintest whiff of smoke reached my nose. At first I dismissed it, thinking a neighbor had lit a fire pit, but within minutes the smell thickened, acrid and heavy, seeping into the walls. By the time I stepped outside, the horizon behind my ranch glowed an ominous orange, flickering like a beast awakening. Flames were tearing through my stables, racing toward the main house with a hunger that made my skin crawl. And there, at the edge of the street, I caught sight of silhouettes, figures standing motionless, watching, their faces hidden in the shadows, but their presence undeniable. They didn't move to help, didn't shout for assistance. They stood in silence, like witnesses to a spectacle they themselves had orchestrated. The fire department would later claim it was an accident, perhaps faulty wiring. But I knew better. I had seen deliberate destruction before, ordered and carried out with precision, and this bore all the marks. The HOA hadn't just declared war. They had crossed into criminal territory. Watching the fire consume everything I had built, I felt something shift inside me. They thought flames would scare me into submission, but what they had really done was awaken. The part of me that had broken crime families and dismantled corruption rings from the bench. They had just burned down the wrong man's house. In the aftermath of the fire, when the smoke still clung to my lungs and ash coated the ruins of my home, I did not rage as they expected me to. Rage is messy, rage is reckless, and recklessness was a luxury I could not afford. Instead, I turned inward, into the cold precision that had once earned me the reputation of being a feared judge. My enemies in the courtroom had called me the guillotine, not because I shouted or slammed gavels, but because I was methodical, unflinching, and always 10 steps ahead. That same discipline became my weapon now. I began piecing together their mistakes, the arrogance in their actions. They hadn't been careful. They had left trails, phone records of late-night calls, financial discrepancies. In the HOA books, suspicious insurance policies hastily filed just weeks before the fire. I hired no investigators, no outsiders. I had the skills, the contacts, the legal mind to dismantle them from within. Each night I documented everything in silence, storing evidence in a hidden safe, the way a predator waits in the dark before the strike. I was no longer a homeowner defending his property. I was a hunter, stalking those who had mistaken fire for victory. They wanted me afraid, but what they would soon discover was that fear had no place in my world. Only justice did. I began with whispers, not war. Justice, I knew, wasn't about striking first. It was about letting your opponent collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. The HOA members believed the fire had silenced me, but silence can be far louder than rage. I leaked small fragments of truth into the right ears, an anonymous report. to the fire marshal about irregular accelerants at the scene, a quiet tip to the insurance company about fraudulent claims, a subtle nudge to a journalist who had long suspected corruption in our community board. I watched the cracks form, slow and almost invisible at first. Board members turning suspicious eyes on one another, the president growing nervous as questions piled higher than his lies could cover. Every time I walked through the neighborhood, their conversations faltered, their smiles strained. They wondered how much I knew, and worse, how much I was willing to reveal. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just documenting their sins anymore. I was weaving a noose out of their own deeds, tightening it one thread at a time. Fear was shifting. It no longer lived in me. It was seeping into them, room by room, meeting by meeting, until even the most arrogant among them began to wonder if the fire they had lit would end up burning them alive. The HOA's once perfect facade began to crumble in ways even I hadn't anticipated. Their meetings, once polished displays of control, devolved into bickering and accusations. I didn't need to be inside the room to hear it. The walls of that community hall had thin cracks, and neighbors eager to gossip carried the rest. The treasurer suddenly resigned, claiming family issues, though everyone knew he was. Terrified of being caught in the financial irregularities I had quietly exposed. The president, once smug and commanding, now looked over his shoulder. At every gathering, his voice cracking as he tried to restore order. Some members whispered about anonymous letters showing up in their mailboxes, detailing their roles in the fire, though I had sent none. Fear was doing the work for me. By then, paranoia had become my strongest ally. They suspected each other more than they suspected me, and the beauty of it all was that I barely needed to lift a hand. Each day, their unity fractured further, until the same men and women who had laughed as my house burned were now afraid to meet one another's eyes, afraid of the truth they knew was coming. The first cracks became fractures the moment law enforcement entered the picture. It started with a seemingly small investigation, just a local fire marshal following up on suspicious insurance claims. But when whispers reached federal ears, everything changed. I watched from a distance as subpoenas landed like thunderbolts, dragging board members into interviews they were unprepared for. Their confident postures melted into nervous twitches as investigators pressed them on missing funds, false reports, and their curious decision to host a so-called emergency auction just days after my house burned down. What none of them realized was that the moment they set fire to my home, they crossed into federal jurisdiction. Arson, insurance fraud, and racketeering weren't local HOA disputes. They were federal crimes. And I, Christopher, a federal judge, didn't need to lift a finger to push the case forward. All I had to do was wait, while the very system I had dedicated my life to serve closed in on them with the precision of a tightening noose. It didn't take long before the once united HOA board began to devour itself from the inside. Faced with the weight of federal charges, each member suddenly discovered a new instinct for survival: betrayal. The president, who had barked orders with iron confidence, now whispered about acting under pressure and pointed fingers at his vice president. The treasurer, whose books hid years of theft and mismanagement, offered up names in exchange for leniency. Even the secretary, who had gleefully drafted letters threatening homeowners, tried to cast herself as a victim manipulated by the others. What they didn't realize was that these frantic confessions only tied them deeper together, weaving a tapestry of guilt that investigators could pull apart at will. I followed every update quietly, with the steady composure of a man who had seen hundreds of criminals try this very tactic in my courtroom. I knew how it would end: fragmented, exposed, and desperate. Their empire of intimidation, once so bold, was crumbling not because of me, directly, but because their own greed and cowardice left them no way out. The arrests came swiftly, with the kind of finality that only federal warrants can bring. At dawn, quiet suburban streets that once echoed with HOA patrols and smug committee meetings now shook under the weight of flashing lights and unmarked cars. Agents moved with precision, doors were kicked in, and one by one, the board members were led out in handcuffs, their neighbors staring in stunned silence. The same people who once boasted about power over every mailbox, lawn, and fence now stood exposed in their pajamas, shivering under the weight of justice. News crews swarmed like vultures, capturing the fall of these self-proclaimed rulers who had believed themselves untouchable. And through it all, I remained in the background, not as the victim they had once mocked, but as the judge who knew their punishment had only just begun. For them, this was humiliation. For me, it was closure. The ranch they tried to destroy stood tall behind me, untouched, a reminder that their greed had burned themselves instead of me. As I watched the board members hauled away, I realized their punishment wasn't just the prison sentences that awaited them. It was the slow erosion of their carefully crafted facades. These were people who once paraded themselves as the pillars of the community, dictating every trivial rule as if they were kings and queens of suburbia. Now, stripped of their titles and their arrogance, they faced a fate far worse than losing their positions. They faced the judgment of every neighbor who had suffered under their tyranny. The irony was sharp. They had burned down my house to assert dominance, but in doing so, they had burned down their own lives. My profession had taught me that justice isn't always about what happens in the courtroom. Sometimes it's about letting people be destroyed by the very power they tried to abuse. And in that moment, I knew this story wasn't just about me reclaiming what was mine. It was about exposing a system that thrived on intimidation and showing the world how fragile false authority truly is. In the silence that followed, I stood among the ashes of what was once my home, and yet I felt no defeat. The HOA had thought that fire would erase me, but instead it became the torch that revealed their corruption in its rawest form. What they didn't realize was that I had never been afraid of losing walls or wood. I had seen far worse in my years as a judge. Fear, I knew, was their true weapon. They thrived on it, bending neighbors to their will, convincing families they were powerless. But fear is also fragile. It crumbles the moment someone refuses to bow. By standing my ground, I hadn't just destroyed a corrupt board. I had reminded an entire community that they had a voice. And as the dust settled, I could see the shift in my neighbors' eyes. No longer timid, no longer silent. They realized that the so-called rulers of their lives were nothing more than desperate cowards hiding behind titles. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. Looking back now, I realized the fire was never the end. It was the beginning. What the HOA had set ablaze was not my home, but their own empire of intimidation. In trying to destroy me, they exposed themselves to the justice they thought would never touch them. And as a judge, I couldn't help but see the irony. They had written their own verdict in flames. I rebuilt not just a house, but a legacy, a reminder that no title, no board, no corrupt circle of neighbors can strip away what you rightfully own. My ranch rose again, stronger and more untouchable than ever. And though scars remained, they stood as proof that power only holds sway until someone refuses to yield. To this day, when I walk the land, I hear echoes of that night, the crackle of fire, the weight of loss, but also the quiet triumph of justice finally served. The HOA thought they could break me. Instead, they made me unshakable. When the dust finally settled, the HOA was nothing more than a memory, a shattered shell of arrogance that once believed itself untouchable. Court orders dismantled their entire structure, their leaders facing criminal charges. That echoed across the country as a warning to every corrupt association. Yet for me, the deeper victory wasn't in their punishment, but in reclaiming what was mine. Walking across the charred remains of my land, I began rebuilding not just a home, but a fortress of resilience. Neighbors who once lived in fear now stood proudly beside me, no longer bound by the HOA's grip, but united in a newfound freedom. The ashes became a foundation for something greater, something no corrupt hand could ever take again. Years later, the ranch stands as a symbol of survival and strength. Its walls, whispering stories of a war fought not with violence but with unshakable will. As I sit on the porch at dusk, watching the horizon burn with the orange glow of sunset, I am reminded of how easily power can corrupt and how vital it is to resist it. The HOA tried to erase me with fire, but instead they forged me into something stronger, unyielding, immovable, unbreakable. Justice was not just delivered in the courtroom, it was carved into the very soil of my land. And for every homeowner who has ever been bullied, threatened, or silenced, my story stands as proof. No force, no fire, and no corrupt board can ever take from you what you are willing to fight for. And so, what began as a fire meant to destroy my life became the very spark that ignited my fight for justice. The HOA thought they could erase me, silence me, and claim victory through fear. But in the end, They exposed themselves for the world to see. My ranch still stands, stronger than ever, while their names are buried under the weight of their own corruption. If there's one truth I've learned, it's this: power without conscience always collapses, and those who wield it carelessly will one day face the reckoning they never saw coming. For me, justice was not just a verdict, it was survival, it was victory, and it was a reminder that no matter how dark the night, the dawn always belongs to those who refuse to bow. If you've stayed with me through this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HOA Rule Rage for more real stories of power, corruption, and the justice that always finds its way back. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps expose the truth that others try to bury.